right, all right, all right. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. All right, splendid. Let's get started immediately. We don't have that much time. So my name is Jakob from Gleechi. I have with me my dear colleague, Dr. Hbner. And I'm actually going to start off with a video immediately because that quite well tells what we're trying to achieve with Gleechi.
What about this? And how many times has this happened to you? Well, suffer no more, because we've created a product that is designed to eliminate these problems and improve your quality of life significantly. Introducing Hands. Hands were specifically designed to facilitate manual tasks and to eliminate problems associated with not having hands, such as inability to high-five and difficulties communicating your hip-hop coastal allegiance. West Side! Damn it! With Hands, you'll be able to hold mug, play keyboard, write a story about bird farts, point at ketchup.
So I think this guy pretty much nails it. If I didn't have hands already, I would definitely want hands after seeing this. So this is what we've been working on, but for robots, to enable robots to use their hands to pick up a cup of coffee, to point at ketchup, and write a story about bird farts, especially the last one. And we've been doing that for about 8 years, when VR started becoming quite a big thing about 2-3 years ago. And we realized that there's quite a lot of similarities between robots and animated characters, especially in virtual reality. And we realized that the problem that we've been focusing on, the kind of hands, to grasp and interact with hands, is probably going to be a big problem within virtual reality as well. Back then, this was the kind of typical example of the only free hand interaction out there. And I mean, it's a fantastic game, but the hand interaction might not look super realistic, I don't know. So yeah, no shit, surgery failed. But of course a lot of things has happened during the latest 2 years, and a lot of input controllers are coming to the markets, but we still see this prediction about making hands look realistic and natural, especially when interacting, that is a problem in VR still. For example, in a Toybox demo, I mean, it's a very good demo, but it's still the thing that your fingers penetrate the kind of objects in different ways when you try to interact. Same goes with a lot of the leap motion demos, for example. This one, the fingers just penetrates it. We see other types of strange interactions sometimes when things kind of pop into your hand magically. Same goes in Adrift. This is a little bit more subtle, but you still kind of notice that things just jump into your hand. Within Job Simulator, they actually have a quite interesting method of making the hands invisible. So you only see the objects you're picking up floating around. So you actually they represent the hands, so to speak. But all of these are, in our eyes, kind of different examples of hands being difficult to work with, to make it look natural and realistic when actually using your hands in VR. And the problem is related to this little character here. This is what the brain sees in terms of the body. The hands are enormously big because they are so extremely complex. This is also something we've been seeing in game development for quite a few years. I think this is from Mixamo, where you on the kind of the left side of things see how many joints you need when you have fully articulate hands. That is 65 joints. When you don't have fully articulate hands, you only need 25 joints. So you almost triple the amount of joints needed for a body to kind of use the hands and make them look natural and realistic. And of course, hands are difficult when you look at these kind of figures and facts. And it's especially difficult when trying to interact with objects, because we can interact with objects in so many different ways. So, of course, we are very much in the very beginning of virtual reality right now. We try new things. We learn new things every day. But some of these problems, smart people have been working with for over 50 years, very focused within robotics. So Kai will share a little bit about some of the things we learned about, especially hands in robotics, and how this is relevant in virtual reality.
Yeah, thank you, Jakob. Can everybody hear me? So as Jakob said, can't hear me. Hello? Check. Nobody can hear me? No it works? Fine. Great. So as Jakob said, there has been some evolution that you all know about in gaming and animation, as we can see here in this example. A very similar evolution has happened in robotics, where around 50 years ago, actually the first so-called robotic hand was developed. It's very simple parallel jaw gripper, it's called, just 1 degree of freedom to pick up different things. But nowadays, what we have been working on actually in different European research projects are more humanoid kind of robots, like this one. This one is called Hbner. It's from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany, and is one of the platforms that we have integrated our technology in. So what we can see here is that the task of the robot is to first observe objects through the cameras that are in the head there, to, in the end, actually execute grasps on the objects by arms and fingers. What we need in between is a planning stage, different machine learning techniques to actually tell the robot how to pick up things. And as you can see here, from one side and the other side, it's not only dependent on the object, but also on the task. What are you actually going to do with these objects? And while this is like robotic forward pipeline, when searching the correspondence in animation and gaming, we could say we a little bit go for the other side. So what you are used to is you start with a motion controller, some kind of input control. Then you go to the hand design and animation. How are you actually going to make these hands and fingers move? And in the end, you have the problem of making the interaction look good. So I think what should be obvious here, and shouldn't be a big step to think that this robot actually could be some kind of avatar. Or there are very similar principles. And the first thing I want to highlight here is about the topic of hand design and inputs. In robotics research, when you ask yourself the question, what hand do you actually need for your application, you can differentiate between performance and flexibility. These manufacturing grippers that we saw also in the beginning are still nowadays mostly used in industry because they are very fast, very strong, very accurate, and you can repeat tasks very quickly. While these flexible hands, where you probably want to have more kind of different interactions with different objects, you don't get the same performance. And obviously, what the vision for roboticists is to have some kind of hand that is very like the human hand. Note here that the human hand is a little bit lower on the scale of performance because, I mean, what manufacturing hands can do in the manufacturing line, obviously there has been some reason why they replaced humans there. And when you try to find a parallel for gaming, what input do you need for application? I think that's a very important question here, is you can draw a similar two-dimensional space of performance. How simple is your input? How user-friendly, developer-friendly? And you could say that some kind of motion controller, 6D, positional orientation and tracking, and just a button would probably be a quite user-friendly interface. While when you want to have full flexibility in all the finger tracking, you maybe want to go for a 3D camera towards really human-like interaction. And two examples for this, maybe some of you have been at the Bullet Train talk this morning by Epic Games, where they use the Oculus Touch. Here, the interface to an object is quite simple. You have one button click, one way to interact with the different objects, which are usually guns. While in another application, where you have a lot of objects that you might want to interact in different ways with, like hammers or scissors or whatever is in a complex scene, you have to think about how to interact with these things naturally and how to create natural interaction. So that makes an important point, that actually the object itself is kind of the source of interaction. The object tells you how to interact with it. And that's what we in research call affordances. And some of you might have heard about it. I took the Wikipedia explanation, which is a little bit twisted. It says an affordance is a relation between an object and an organism that through a collection of stimuli affords the opportunity for that organism to perform an action. In a nutshell, it mainly means that objects already tell you how to interact with them. Like in the bullet train talk this morning, we heard about this handle problem. When people actually are in this scene, in that train, they maybe are not interested in guns. They maybe want to actually hold the handle. And there is a similar concept for robots. I mean, when they see handles, then they should pick things up at the handles. A very nice example of this can be seen in the gallery by Cloudite Games, where you can see actually which objects are interactable, and also you can see, as humans, how to interact with them. I mean, if there's a handle like this one on the left side, obviously what you want to do is to move it like this. While when there's a wheel, you maybe want to rotate it in a different way. And that brings us to the way of which grasps you are going to pick for different objects. And in robotics, that is what we call grasp taxonomies. So that grasps are organized in a hierarchy of different grasps. You can see them here on the right side. And dependent on the object and what you want to do with it, for example, these are eggs, but they are picked up in different ways. So if you want to inspect an object, like with the left hand, you maybe want to use a precision grasp. While when you have a platform grasp, like this in the other example here, then you maybe want to pick another grasp. And what's interesting also, again, trying to draw parallels between robots and avatars and humans, is a study made by Dollar two years ago that describes a little bit the relation between all these concepts of tools, objects, affordances, and taxonomies. So what he did is he observed two different workers, a housemaid and a machinist, over a day, and just counted what grasps and how many they did. And what's interesting is that both of them use more than 50% on only 3 particular grasps. And these are here examples on the left side for the particular grasps that they mostly use. And the other thing that is interesting here is that 60% of grasp that the housemaid does is really power grasp, force grasps, while the machinist does more like precision pinch grasps. So if you are in a game like this one, like a job simulator, and you have to follow specific tasks, that means that all the objects might afford different interactions and different grasps. If you want to pick the pan there, for example, maybe you want to power grasp on the handle, while when you want to pick up all the forks that are on the bottom there, maybe you rather pick a precision grasp. And what we learned on this, using these concepts, Jakob has formulated some 10 rules. So I hand back to him to give you a little bit more feedback about this.
I think rules is a little bit pushing it. Some learnings we took from actually working with this. So as I mentioned earlier, about 1.5 years ago, we took this kind of software that we used for enabling robots to pick things up. And we took the knowledge we gained from the field of robotics, and we actually started experimenting with VR. So this is the first demo that we put together about 1.5 years ago. And this was essentially what we do here is that we took the Tuscany demo from Oculus and we used some kind of razor Hbner controllers. I think one scene is leap motion as well, and essentially enable you to see your hands picking up things and making it look natural and realistic. So this was a very early stage experiment, and it looks quite decent on a 2D screen, but we discovered quite quickly that it's not as immersive in VR. So we've been working a lot with this for the latest 1.5 years, learning quite a lot when working focused on hands and kind of making that feel and look nice. So we will share a couple of things. We have quite limited amount of time, but these are the key things. The representation of the hand, what should the actual hand kind of look like in a virtual space? The object interaction, as Kai already touched upon, and a few thoughts about the input technologies out there. So first off, one of the very classic things within robotics that we talk about is this kind of uncanny valley. You probably recognize this from these kind of freaky robots. For some reason they are always Japanese, I don't know why. They are really creepy, and the whole principle about this is based on this graph. Essentially, it says that things that are more human-like tends to be more familiar and comfortable, right? So we start with the kind of industrial robots in the very beginning, not very familiar, not very human-like. You have, for example, R2-D2, a little bit more, human-like, a little bit more familiar. You have C-3PO, who starts to actually look like a proper human being, but you would never mistake him for a human, right? And then we get to a very interesting point, this little peak here. And that is when something is very human-like, but it still doesn't really feel like a human, and you're not feeling uncomfortable with it. In robotics, we call this the Nicki Minaj point. And after that, something very interesting happens. It goes straight down, and things start feeling extremely uncomfortable and creepy. And this is where you have this kind of robots. I don't know if you can see this picture here very clearly. If you look a little bit closer. So this is one of the robots that I've been talking about. And I think it's a Japanese robotics researcher who did a kind of copy of his wife. And she walked into this classroom with little kids and started talking. And they couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. But everyone started like, crying, and thought it was terrible and freaky. So we're very well aware of this kind of effect in robotics. And further up the line you have, for example, Tintin, which is a typical example of a very human-like character that behaves very, very much human-like, but is not freaky. So all this also applies to hands. In robots we focus on prosthetic hands. And as you can see, the curve is it's kind of amplified if you have moving things. So this is very relevant when you work with prosthetic hands, because you don't want them to feel, freaky and creepy. This applies as well in virtual reality. We discovered that if you have a couple of hands that look very human-like, but they don't really behave like proper human hands, you get freaked out and you lose the feeling of presence. So we know that you can actually succeed with having very realistic hands. We experimented with it a lot, and it works, but it takes a lot of effort and time. So if you don't have all that time, you should rather try and have more abstract representation of the hands. For example, a robotics hands, or a hand that's obviously kind of animated or transparent. So the second kind of learning we did was that when we actually succeed in having kind of realistic hands that are on the right side of the uncanny valley, you still want to avoid a couple of things. For example, different hand personalities. For example, one thing we saw that if the hands behave like human hands, but, for example, it might be a different skin color from your own hands, then people don't really relate to the hands. Another example we saw is that if you see these, manly big hands, and you yourself have exceptionally small hands, then that is a problem as well. So kind of a typical thing we saw here is that if you put on a couple of gloves, that quite easily solves these problems. The gloves don't even have to cover the whole hands. The third thing we learned was be consistent. So if you want to create a feeling of presence for the user, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to make kind of the game more realistic. Actually, it can make it more difficult because you get closer to this kind of uncanny valley, which breaks the presence. If you are on, so to speak, the right side of the uncanny valley, you have a couple of gloves or human hands that represent your hands, you need to put a lot of effort into the interaction, actually making it look realistic. And this can be a pain in the ass for developers quite often. If you're on the more abstract level of the uncanny valley, you have kind of robot hands or animated hands, you can get away with a lot other things, like this kind of object popping into your hand and these kind of interactions. Transparent hands is a very good solution when you have this kind of interaction, when fingers penetrate an object. That works extremely well. You don't get kicked out of the presence, at least from what we've seen. It's also quite good in virtual reality because you have this problem with hands being able to penetrate walls and tables, so transparent hands actually work extremely well. Cartoon hands, another example. We already mentioned Job Simulator. The first time I tried it, I was completely amazed because they have this thing called tomato presence that they talk about, which, as I mentioned earlier, when you pick something up, the object actually represents your hands suddenly instead. The hand becomes invisible. Now this works very well with more abstract representation of the hands, but not so well when you have these kind of realistic hands that we talked about earlier. Finally, if you have some kind of game that is based on actually having tools, it's a very good solution. Just have the tools representing your hands instead of trying to have hands constantly holding them. Controllers work fairly well as well to represent the hands. It can be quite good, for example, the HTC Vive controllers, to actually see them so you don't smack them together. And in those cases, having this kind of static interaction when things just get kind of attached to the controller works quite well. So yeah, in essence, I mean, the more abstract the representation of the hand is, the less work you actually have to put in making interaction and actually using the hands look natural. Skipped arms, you probably heard this a couple of times by now. The main problem, there's plenty of problems with having arms and bodies, of course, but the main problem is that we, right now, only track where the hand is positioned. So the arm can be a little bit, everywhere. We believe that inverse kinematics, we're going to be able to solve this with inverse kinematics, because the human body is fairly easy to predict in terms of what you do, depending on what you're trying to do with your hands. We haven't seen any good examples yet. We've seen a couple of decent examples, but it's not good enough if it works, 9 out of 10 times. Think long and hard about every object you put in a scene. So this one is quite important because you can't just put up a scene and put up a setting just because it looks nice. Because as soon as people have hands that they can interact with, and have some kind of representation of hands, they want to interact with everything all the time. So preferably, you should make everything in a scene interactable and be able to do things with it. Make it obvious how people are supposed to interact with their objects. Kai touched upon this earlier regarding affordances. You don't want objects that you can do a bunch of different things with, because then people are going to try and do a bunch of different things with them, and it's going to be more difficult to develop it the way you intended. So putting big handles, for example, is a very good way of kind of tricking the people into doing the interactions that you intend them to do. And related to that is, of course, also this about affordances, as Kai mentioned. You have to think about what are people actually wanting to do with the different objects. So in our first demo, we had this kind of glass. Usually you use a glass to drink from, maybe put it in the dishwasher. But what every single person was, they take it up, they look at it, smack it in the floor. And then they get pissed off because it doesn't break. So you need to think about what people actually want to do in the virtual environment about all this. Pick the most natural grass might sound obvious, but then again, as Kai mentioned earlier, there's plenty of different grasp, and you tend to interact with a single object in many different ways, depending on what you want to do. If you have a knife, for example, you can pick it up in kind of this power grasp if you want to stab someone. But if you want to give it to someone, you're going to do this little pinch grasp. So you need to think about that when kind of designing this interaction, so it really seems natural for the players. Choose a controller based on the use case and not the other way around. So we see a lot of different input controllers hitting the market. And generally we see 3 big trends here. We have the motion controllers, which is kind of becoming some kind of standard, which we think is much related to them being kind of the only ones that has been really robust and always working. Apart from that, you also have the kind of 3D sensors and different gloves. So it's generally a couple of differences with these, different advantages and disadvantages. Motion controllers are very good for game development because, as Kai talked about earlier, it's much easier if the user can only interact with things with one button click and just pick things up, and you don't have to think about all the stuff they do with their fingers. But sometimes you want finger tracking, and it's extremely important, especially in this kind of social virtual reality experiences, where you want to talk and communicate with someone, because body language is like 70% of the way we communicate. So you definitely want to have the hands and fingers in. And the same goes, I mean, if you have the finger tracking, you might want some kind of haptic feedback. This is a typical thing we heard from surgeons, that when looking at doing surgical training systems, they want finger tracking and haptic feedback. So we definitely think that 3D sensor and gloves are going to become much more common now when they have been improving. I mean, we were not huge fans of Leap Motion until they released the new software, and suddenly I think it's the Orion software, and suddenly works much better. We've been experimenting with a lot of gloves, and a lot of things is happening there as well. We experiment with a little bit with the Manus VR gloves, which are working fantastic. So think about what the use case is and what you need from, instead of just picking a motion controller based on what seems to be some kind of standard. In either case, use feedback. Now this is important. When in robotics, we always have some kind of feedback, so the robot actually knows they managed to pick something up. Haptic feedback is the absolutely easiest thing to work with, because you just need a kind of buzzing feeling when you pick something up, and that feels very immersive. If you don't have haptic feedbacks, for example with 3D sensors, you need to have other kind of feedback that tells you that you succeed in picking something up. Audio cues can be one thing, that you actually make a sound when you manage to pick it up. Visual cues can be extremely good as well. If the object is highlighted prior to the grasp and then you succeed with it, the highlight disappears. Yeah. And finally, our last learning for today. Sometimes hands and feedback can get a little bit weird. I mean, as soon as we have introduced natural-looking hands and people start seeing, other human avatars, people start doing weird stuff. And I think this is just going to get worse as we get kind of gloves and these kind of things with a lot of haptic feedback, so you can actually feel things. I saw this video from Tesla Studios with haptic gloves, and they demo it with this, like Lara Croft standing, and some kids sitting in a basement touching. That is weird. That's weird. So yeah, sometimes hands and feedback probably might get weird, so think about that. We think hands are extremely interesting, period. If you guys want to talk about more hands, please get in touch with us. Follow me on Twitter. I write very smart and interesting stuff there, I promise. And I think that's it for us today. Questions?
Hi.
Shoot.
I was curious about something. Have you seen anybody just do forearms, not past the elbows, and how does that work?
We've been experimenting quite a lot with the arms, but kind of a weird thing is that you don't really get this movement.
The wrist,
so sometimes, yeah, exactly. So sometimes you don't really know what's wrist movement and kind of the arms. We did one experiment that I could actually show you afterwards, but sometimes the arm kind of went in weird different ways. So I'm not a huge fan of it. I tried the Servius, the raw data demo that they have here. You should try it out. I'm not a huge fan of it. It doesn't work super good so far.
You just end to here?
Yeah, that's what we recommend at this point.
Cool, thanks.
Is there an average hand size? So like if you're going for realistic hands, doing the glove thing, I modeled my hands after my own hands, so they look exactly right every time, but I assume for someone else they're going to be smaller or bigger. Is there a good average?
Yeah, there is an average size for male hands and female hands, and it varies a little bit based on what part of the world you're from. I don't have the numbers in my head, but usually at least it's a good thing to have a size for male and females, because that's a quite big difference.
You're recommending abstract or transparent, cartoony, or non-ethnically specific hands. What about a role-playing game where you're supposed to put the player in the role of a specific character that is of a specific ethnicity? How do you feel about that?
I would guess that the thing is, we base this on how people have been testing the different applications, and I got to say that not everyone actually reacts to having different skin colors or different sizes. It's some people who do. I would think that if you have a game where you're supposed to, put yourself in another person, your mindset is focused on that you would be more open to it, absolutely. I also want to highlight the fact that we're not recommending necessarily that you only use transparent hands or cartoony hands. We think that's going to go two quite different directions with VR the coming few years. One going towards is like hyper-realism, where you really want to replicate the world and have fully working hands. But it's a lot easier if you're developing a game and you want to focus on the gameplay to make it easier for yourself at this point, because you can build presence anyways.
Just quickly, I was wondering if you had, over the course of your experiments, achieved a moment on that far side of the uncanny valley, anticipating what you were just talking about, the hyper-realistic hands.
Yeah, we have, and that's kind of what we're focusing on mainly with Gleechi, to create this kind of hand movement and interaction that feels completely natural and realistic. So that is mainly what we're working with, and we have experienced it. And of course, it doesn't work 100% of the time all the time, but we're slowly progressing to that point.
Can you speak a little bit about the payoff or the consequences of that?
Working with hyper-realism in general. Yeah, of course. Do you have anything to add, Kai? I mean, in essence, it is related to a little bit what we talked about here, that the more realistic you make it, the bigger the chances are that some interactions might look weird and off, and if you have too much interactions and too much objects out there, there's a big chance that you will lose the feeling of presence. So I think that's the big payoff. What we're trying to do is to make this easy by having a software solution that kind of make this optimized to interact based on the mesh data. But it's always going to be kind of, people are going to have higher expectations when you have a more realistic game. So you would expect not only for you to grasp an object in a natural way, but actually grasp it in a natural way. If it looks like an object that's supposed to be heavy, then you would want the character to react differently. So there's a lot of challenges related to that in maintaining the feeling of presence. Yeah. All right. Splendid. Thank you all very much.